A few weeks ago, I began working on a new monologue. I knew that I wanted to say something about the standard of our latest intake of MPs. And as I sat at my computer, I found myself writing about Ann Widdecombe, whose death had just been announced, although not yet, its horrific circumstances. I'd thought of Anne, whose company I'd enjoyed on several occasions and whose Catholic faith I share, because in her 23 years as an MP, she was everything a parliamentarian should be: independent, resolute, humane. In one of her final political interventions made before her death, Anne observed that our current crop of MPs was, in her view, the least capable in living memory. When Ann Widdecombe became an MP in 1987, the House of Commons was a cockpit, the debates such a spectacle that the American news networks took Prime Minister's questions live, in full. It was, believe it or not, box office viewing. Don't take my word for it. Have a look at YouTube. There was wit, erudition, soaring oratory. Now, not so much. Until recently, only MPs at the dispatch box were permitted to read from notes. MPs who did so from elsewhere on the green benches were howled down, reading, reading. Other MPs would heckle, scolding them for snatching a glance at a piece of paper. Switch on today, however, and you'll see MPs not just reading speeches from notes, but lacking the self-assurance to ask questions or raise point of orders without them. This change might be welcomed by those who think our Parliament is too aggressive, too macho, too male. Barracking someone just because they can't remember or can't extemporise what they want to say without having it written down is probably no longer considered very kind. But kind or cruel, I think it says something about the quality of many of our MPs today, and Widdecombe certainly thought so. It's especially true of several substandard Labour MPs, many of whom didn't think they stood a cat in hell's chance of getting elected until Keir Starmer delivered his unexpectedly big and, as it's turned out, unsustainable majority in 2024. Of the 232 Labour MPs elected then, no fewer than 72 had backgrounds working where? In business, engineering, agriculture? No, 72 of those newly elected Labour MPs came from the charity sector. Unlike Ann Widdecombe, many of these Labour MPs feel like one-hit wonders, a single term in office and then back to being head of kindness at Oxfam or whatever. And this sense of Parliament is a sort of supercharged sabbatical, an experience, a bit of a lark, for people who aren't fit for much else, has become increasingly clear. It was there in Portcullis House, Parliament's overflow building, in March this year, when 40 MPs, not just Labour MPs, but Tories and Lib Dems too, decided to dance for the cameras to raise awareness about obesity. America had literally just started bombing Iran. The Middle East was in flames. British nationals were hiding in bomb shelters, and these MPs were performing the tango. They seem to symbolise the narcissistic frivolousness of a lightweight political class who act like they've been elected to a students' union, not the mother of parliaments, not so much the rump parliament as the chump parliament. They say a fish rots from the head down, and Keir Starmer, for me, exemplified where we've gone wrong. A few weeks ago, our now former Prime Minister stood in front of the cameras and talked about how he was leaving the country better off than when he arrived in office. Here was a man, if ever there was, who should have left the stage quietly and with humility, and for that matter with the general election. Instead, showing the fragile vanity that is the hallmark of this generation of politicians, Starmer lauded his own legacy. He even said he was resigning with good grace. It's not a judgment for him to make, by the way. Starmer epitomises the decline in the standard of those who feel justified in believing they can decide how the rest of us live. By contrast with those who have gone before, he is a pygmy politician, starved of anything remotely resembling a hinterland. When Starmer appeared on the BBC's Desert Island Discs, he couldn't think of a novel or poem to take with him onto an imaginary desert island. Instead, he chose an atlas. What would his predecessors have made of that? Michael Foot, Labour leader in the 1970s, was the author of acclaimed biographies. Or Roy Hattersley, Labour's former deputy leader who died earlier this summer. but not before writing no fewer than 25 books. Or Dennis Healey, a former Labour Chancellor who I once had the pleasure of sharing a walk with, who amassed a library containing some 16,000 titles. Even former Prime Ministers who did not get a particularly sympathetic write-up from history were, in their own way, remarkable. Edward Heath, the former Tory Prime Minister, sailed around the world, and he was a concert pianist. The man whose career Heath finished, Enoch Powell, was a professor of Greek. By the age of 25, he spoke half a dozen languages, including Urdu. Most of them had one thing in common, namely wartime service. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Enoch Powell enlisted as a private. He left a brigadier. Margaret Thatcher's first cabinet had 3 ministers who had won the Military Cross in World War II. What would they make of a politician like Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, who, before entering politics, worked at a Harley Street clinic from where he boasted of his ability to use hypnosis to make the breasts of his clients bigger? To a very great extent, we, of course, get the politicians we deserve. As a society, we've become less bookish, more online, less martial, more pampered. We all, well, most of us, spend more time on social media, having spent less time in the trenches or in uniform or in genuine peril. We've not faced the hardships our grandparents faced. Most of us, as the philosopher Roger Scruton was wont to say, have lost the tragic sense of life. But while we know our 21st century politicians haven't been shaped by struggle and conflict and suffering in the way their predecessors were in the 20th century, we can, I think, at least expect them to demonstrate some self-awareness, to stop with the self-pity. Because compared to previous generations, they really have nothing to be pitied for. We should reasonably be able to expect today's politicians to stop blaming other things for their own shortcomings, to be a bit more like Ann Widdecombe, who, for all that she was a politician with strong convictions, never lost the ability to laugh at herself, to admit to herself and to the rest of us that she was wrong when she was wrong and faintly ridiculous when she was being faintly ridiculous. In death, Anne became the victim of a horrible crime, but in life, she never played the victim card. She didn't hide behind being a woman or complain when, as often happened, she was on the receiving end of some pretty cruel remarks about her personal appearance. By contrast, when our ex-Chancellor Rachel Reeves faced a barrage of criticism from financial experts after her budget last year, she dismissed it as mansplaining. Nothing to do with her making a series of lamentable economic decisions while repeatedly overstating her qualifications for the job. No, for Reeves, it was all down to sexism and those nasty, patronising men of the markets. Then there was Angela Rayner. I think there's actually quite a lot to like about Rayner. Not many women could have a baby at 16, become a grandmother by 37, hence Grandula Rayner, and be Deputy Prime Minister by her early 40s. But like Reeves, she seemed to play the sexism card when the going got tough and the taxman mounted an investigation into her financial affairs. And she also invoked the idea that she got the stick she did, not just because she was a woman, but because she was from the wrong side of the tracks as well. This sort of bleating would be more plausible were it not coming from a party which once did social mobility like no other. Labour, let us not forget, is the party of Ernest Bevin and Nye Bevan. At the age of 8, Ernest Bevin was orphaned. By 11, he was working in Somerset as a farm labourer. Nye Bevan, well, he had it a bit easier. He left school at 13 to work in a South Wales coal mine. The pair of them created NATO and the NHS, respectively. So don't let anyone use class as an excuse or a shield for incompetence. To expect less from someone because they grew up in a poor household is to embrace the soft bigotry of low expectations. The former Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has also played the class card and played it fairly regularly. Phillipson grew up in a council house, as she often points out, even if her old neighbours say there was nothing exceptional about it. But while keen to talk up her council house upbringing, Phillipson has been less eager to mention that her family took advantage of Margaret Thatcher's right to buy policy, making a 900% profit into the bargain. Again, the contrast with the previous generation of politicians makes today's MPs look petty and mewling. Rayner and Phillipson are totally within their rights to insist that being born into poverty gives them an insight in what it is to be poor. But to suggest that this gives them some sort of moral superiority as a consequence, or a sharper sense of choosing the right policy, well, that's for the birds. And yet Labour seem to revel in this sort of victimhood. But it doesn't just stop at self-pity. There is a spitefulness about Labour right now that should worry each and every one of us. It's there in the language, but also in the policies. In the language of Angela Rayner when she went on stage and called Tory politicians scum. She initially waved away the row about that, insisting she was just using the word scum in a good-humoured way, like you do. Her excuse rang hollow, not least because Labour, more than any other party, keep telling us that the words getting bandied around in politics must not stoke division, lest they provoke actual physical violence against politicians. Rayner later apologised. And you can do that with words, you can take them back. But this Labour spitefulness, it's not just rhetorical, it's practical. This class envy, hatred really, and it comes with real-world consequences that can't be unwound, not ever. I come back to this Labour intake of MPs. As I said, I think many of them didn't expect to get elected in 2024 and don't expect to retain their seats in 2029. So how do they spend this short time in office, these political mayflies, with their few ephemeral moments of power? They act on their basest instincts. They bend politics to their ideology, not their ideology to the public good. They realised how much power they had when they blocked Starmer's plans to reform welfare. They grasped how they could change Britain in the most profound ways. Things like legalising abortion right up until the day of birth, even though there was no mention of such a wicked policy in Labour's manifesto. They can do this because of that freakishly large majority Labour secured in 2024. Remember that Starmer won 63% of seats on just 33% of the votes. That's the smallest vote share of any modern Prime Minister. That victory will not be repeated. Labour, with Burnham now in charge, may not even survive as a major party, but its MPs are determined to leave their mark. Not so much a legacy as a scorched earth policy, a policy of spite and ideological vandalism. You may have lots of reasons to be suspicious of Labour: the empty promises to smash the gangs, the refusal to seriously engage with an inquiry into grooming gangs, the hypocrisy of politicians who called out Boris Johnson for cronyism and accepted endless freebies like there was no tomorrow, the lies over defence spending, the cancelling of local elections, the lunacy of net zero. But the stuff that really matters, that really bothered me anyway, is the stuff which seems to be driven not by any kind of policy logic, but pure class hatred. The sort of politics that destroys things which have taken decades, even centuries, to create, to build, with the stroke of a pen or the click of a mouse. As a working class lad made good, I sometimes struggle to embrace the middle classes. When I go to the theatre in London, I'm often stunned by the sheer rudeness of people, the sense of entitlement. And like anyone with eyes in their head who once had a hole in his pocket, I occasionally find ostentatious displays of wealth really rather revolting. But neither of these things make me hate the rich just because they're rich. Life is more complicated than that, but not, it seems, for Labour. Take the exodus of wealthy people from Britain. Since Labour secured power a little over 2 years ago, some 17,000 millionaires have left these islands. The Guardian, the newspaper most Labour MPs read, scoffs when the ultra-wealthy, the likes of Charlie Mullins, the founder of Pimlico Plumbers, leave Britain. But what Labour MPs choose not to understand, perhaps because so many of them have worked for charities learning how to spend other people's money, is the basic arithmetic of what's happening. Charlie Mullins, for instance, who now divides his time between Spain and Dubai, paid more than £120 million in tax here in Britain before he left. Now he pays out. Britain is dangerously dependent on its highest earners. Almost 1/3 of all income tax is paid by the richest 1%. In fact, it's more skewed than that. The top 0.1% pay 13% of all income tax. Gets worse. The very richest of the richest, the top 0.01%, it's about 4,000 individuals. 4,000 individuals in this country of 70 million pay 6% of all income tax. If one of them leaves the country, it takes the earnings of 1,300 average taxpayers to make up the difference. So when you next hear a Labour MP talking about how those with the broadest shoulders must bear the biggest burden, or how the government is asking them to pay a bit more, asking, by the way, suggests you can refuse. Try that, won't you? Ask yourself what's really happening. Dennis Healey, who I mentioned earlier, the former Labour Chancellor, famously said he planned to tax the rich until the pips squeaked. You'll remember how that ended. This summer is the 50th anniversary of Britain having to be bailed out by the IMF when we, as a country, ran out of cash. Of all the things Rachel Reeves has done, the most stupid was probably her decision to impose inheritance tax on super wealthy foreigners. They could cope with paying more income tax and capital gains tax, all the rest of it, but one minor tweak from Reeves meant their total global wealth, wherever it was, would come under British inheritance tax laws. In other words, when they died, 40% of their worldwide wealth would disappear. Again, it's scorched earth, it's spiteful. Reversing the effects of these changes might be almost impossible. The ultra-wealthy plan for the long term. Having removed their wealth from Britain, it will be a hell of a job to get them to bring it back here. The same principle of long-term self-harm brought about by the sort of posturing that belongs in a sixth-form common room is what lies behind Labour's attack on private schools. More than 100 have closed since the government did what no other government in Europe has thought to do, namely tax education. Some of these schools took centuries to build and create. Gone in a moment. You may well say, good riddance to bad rubbish. All private schools do is raise future snobs. Why should state school pupils sit in classes of 30 or more, while private schools can keep numbers down to about half that, and where there's less exposure to extracurricular activities like being stabbed? Labour said that by imposing VAT on the fees paid by private school parents, the effect has been to raise bills by about a fifth, they will collect money for the struggling state sector. How's that working out? Contrary to stereotypes, not every private school is actually like Eton or Harrow. Most lurch from one academic year to the next, parents from very ordinary backgrounds just about scraping together fees by foregoing holidays and new cars. Again, you may say if they can afford it, they can afford a bit more. Well, many of them can't. And the 100-plus schools that have folded since the VAT rise are everyone's problem. We had a system where some parents, incredibly, were willing to spend thousands of pounds to educate their kids, saving the state the trouble and while still paying taxes as if the state was picking up the tab, paying twice, effectively. Anyone looking at our system from the outside would, rather than demonising private schools, celebrate them for saving taxpayers a fortune. But by taxing education, Labour has forced private schools to close their doors, and the children who went there then have to find places in the state sector. 40,000 of them, according to the Tories. And the 6,000 extra teachers Bridget Phillipson, Labour's then Education Secretary, promised would be paid for by the VAT rise? Nowhere to be seen. When Kemi Badenoch pointed this out at PMQs recently, Bridget Phillipson reacted like a truculent teenager, tweeting that you don't need a posh blazer to learn your times tables. This was a woman in charge of a £120 billion education budget. When Badenoch called Phillipson a spiteful class warrior, Phillipson took umbrage and reverted to the kind of self-pity that has become the default position of so many of this intake of Labour MPs, some of whom took to Twitter to say how awful Badenoch was being. Typical was this from Anna Turley, a former Labour Party chairwoman, no less, who said, "You don't have to send your kids to private school. We have universal education provision in this country." Anna Turley is right. You don't have to send your kids to private school, although, as was quickly pointed out online, she did go to a private school herself. Too many Labour MPs talk the talk about state schools, but then walk the kids to private school, or get around the problem by buying an expensive home near a good state school. I get the hypocrisy. It's difficult aligning principle with pragmatism where children are concerned. What I don't understand is the naked class hatred, the self-destructive spitefulness. I could go on. It's not just taxing the wealthy or schools. It's there in what remains of the family farm tax, which has forced some farms in families for generations to be sold to foreign investors, never to grow food again. You may have your own examples. But I think what lies behind it is what Ann Widdecombe recognised. A cohort of Labour MPs who did not expect to get elected and who are not fit to have their hands and their dyed blue hair anywhere near the levers of power. I'd like to offer some words of encouragement. I'd like to, but I don't think our Parliament of Fools is going to get any better under Burnham. I'm not actually hopeful that even if Labour is obliterated in 2029, that the worst will be behind us, because if you think Labour's MPs are seriously substandard, wait until you see what the Greens have to offer, or worse still, the sectarian politics of the Indian subcontinent as articulated by the so-called Gaza independent MPs, whose numbers will likely grow rapidly in coming years. The House of Commons that Ann Widdecombe joined in 1987 was very far from perfect. It was just as dangerous for MPs. The IRA succeeded in assassinating one Tory minister in the grounds of Parliament itself. And it was just as venal. There was always sex and financial scandals. Tories tended to fall foul of the former, Labour the latter. Yes, there was a strong bias towards men, but behind the suits, the House better represented a broad swathe of human experience. The idea that 70 MPs could come from the charity sector would have seemed very odd to the Parliament Ann Widdecombe served in. No, the scandal of politics in Britain is not sex or money or gender or class. It's about ability and a Labour landslide that left us with some of the thickest MPs ever to rule over us. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.